It's really nice to be on this side of a law school experience rather than that side. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for the opportunity to present at this important conference. I'm really looking forward to exploring the conference's provocative themes through the lens of my faith tradition, Hinduism, which, as you know, is the third largest religion in the world with over 1 billion adherents. I've been a little bit under the weather, so please bear with me. Even though the orienting question of the conference, what would law be like if it were organized around the value of agape, is framed in explicitly Christian terms, I believe that the question touches upon contemporary concerns that are relevant across the world's faith traditions. Indeed, the relationship between love and law is theological at its core, and the dynamic between love and law illuminates profound ethical, moral, and spiritual principles that transcend any individual human experience. Just as Christianity emerges from an Abrahamic context and shares textual sources, prophetic lineages, pilgrimage sites, and a monotheistic God with Judaism and Islam, so too does Hinduism emerge from a Vedic context, sharing a theological framework with the other uniquely Indian religions of Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. These four religions, which have 2 billion followers collectively, are often called the Dharma traditions, and they are all oriented around the foundational Indian concept of dharma. Dharma is a Sanskrit word with no real English translation, although the term has become part of the vernacular of American popular culture, from novels such as Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums and Noah Levine's Dharma Punks to television shows such as Lost and Dharma and Greg. Derived from its Sanskrit root dur, that's my popular culture take on it, derived from its Sanskrit root dur, meaning to uphold and maintain. Dharma is often described as social duty, righteous action, and ethical conduct, but its most common English definition is simply and elegantly law. Accordingly, the interplay of love and law within Hinduism is best understood through the prism of dharma, which is often thought of as Hindu law. Hindu dharma reveals an enduring theological tension between the particular and the universal, between the conventional and the ultimate, and between the human and the divine. From a human perspective, dharma is a set of rules, regulations, and restrictions that defines the social order. The laws that constitute dharma are outlined in a corpus of Hindu legal texts that predate Christianity and are collectively known as the Dharma Shastras. However, from a cosmic perspective, dharma is a set of prayers, sacrifices, and rituals that shapes and supports the universal order. In ancient ceremonial and philosophical texts, such as the Vedas and the Upanishads, dharma is theorized as a moral force that maintains the natural order of the universe. Accordingly, when thinking about love and law in Hinduism, it is necessary to conceptualize love and law from the perspective of both conventional reality and ultimate reality, from both the here and the now and the infinite beyond. For Hindus, there are four primary goals to life: dharma, the maintenance of social and cosmic order; artha, the accumulation of capital and wealth; kama, the pursuit of pleasure; and moksha, which is the liberation from the cycle of cyclic existence. It's the teleological goal of Hinduism and occurs when the individual soul, or the human, becomes one with the divine soul, or God, after one dies. Just as dharma means many things to many people, so too does kama. Kama is most often defined as pleasure, and it can also refer to romantic and sensual love, as popularized by the world's most famous instructional manual on lovemaking, the Kama Sutra. At the level of conventional reality and human existence, kama is mediated by dharma. For thousands of years, the Dharma Shastras have outlined the acceptable parameters of love and marriage based on caste affiliation, gender roles, and other social factors. Even the Kama Sutra imagines love as a social act, and the text regulates how we live in love within societal rules. For the most part, though, the conception of love in the Hindu legal texts is familial love, which is heralded as the bond that keeps the extended family structure together. According to Hindu Dharma, the family is the most important social unit and the primary location where dharma is practiced and preserved. Indeed, from the perspective of dharma, even the institution of the king and the apparatus of the state are primarily set up to protect and support the family unit. This type of familial love is compassionate and egoless, and is best articulated in the prominent Dharma Shastra entitled The Law of Yajnavalkya, verse 6, which reads, "Whatever thing one gives with sincere faith to a worthy recipient at the right place, the right time, and by the right means, that is the entire definition of dharma." This verse is similar to Rabbi Hillel's famous injunction, "That which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. That is the whole of the Torah." Indeed, the law of Yajnavalkya encapsulates the Christian golden rule. So from the perspective of conventional reality and everyday human existence, the simple act of giving is the ethical foundation for law, shaped by love, and all other legal, moral, and social principles emerge out of this altruistic act. However, at the level of ultimate reality as opposed to conventional reality, at the level of the universal order as opposed to the social order, Kama is focused on divine love as opposed to human love. Within the context of Hindu teleology, each person's consciousness is understood as a reflection of divine consciousness, and each individual soul longs to become one with the divine soul. This notion of Kama as love and longing finds its most eloquent and passionate articulation in the devotional poetry of the medieval Bhakti movement in India, and specifically in the literary celebration of the conjugal love between the popular Hindu deity Krishna and his beloved consort Radha. Krishna's love for Radha and vice versa is often depicted through provocative, erotic language, and even the classical Sanskrit texts paint a picture of lovers gone mad when they are apart. Their love is valorized and finds its greatest expression in Jayadeva's 12th century epic Sanskrit poem, the Gita Govinda. And the contemporary devotional song, Saso Ki Malape, which translates as "On the Rosary of My Breath," a song performed by Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs alike, symbolizes the soul's longing for God through the language of the lover and the beloved, and illustrates the teleological union of the individual soul with the universal soul. A couplet from the song reads, quote, "I am engulfed in the hues of love, blending with the image of my beloved, telling the beads of my love, I blend with Krishna himself. I am capable of nothing else but to love the name of love. With each breath on the rosary of my breath, I tell the beads of my lover's name." Such poetry may seem to be profane and even scandalous, but from an allegorical perspective, the love and longing between lovers is emblematic of the pain of separation that the individual soul feels for the divine soul, and that humans feel for God. In many ways, the devotional and erotic poetry is the Hindu equivalent of the Song of Songs, and it depicts law as being in the service of love and not vice versa. Love as law as opposed to law as love. This cosmic perspective is outlined in Hindu wisdom texts, such as the Upanishads, which can be interpreted to support a monistic, non-dualistic theology, which is known in Hinduism as Advaita Vedanta. Indeed, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad expresses the monism of Advaita Vedanta in crystal clear terms. Quote, "For when there is a duality of some kind, then the one can smell the other, the one can see the other, the one can hear the other, the one can greet the other, the one can think of the other, and the one can perceive the other. When, however, the whole has become one's very self, then who is there for one to smell, and by what means? Who is there for one to see, and by what means? Who is there for one to hear, and by what means? Who is there for one to greet, and by what means? Who is there for one to think of, and by what means? Who is there for one to perceive, and by what means?" So from the perspective of ultimate reality and the cosmic order, when we grasp the implications of a monistic divinity that transcends the fundamentally dualistic structure of language, there is no longer love and there is no longer law. How then to reconcile the two extremes of conventional reality and ultimate reality, of the social order and the cosmic order, in a way that fuses dharma and kama, brings together love and law, and is applicable for everyday living? I believe that the best Hindu model for this was articulated and enacted by Mahatma Gandhi through his strategy of satyagraha, which preached nonviolent non-cooperation against British colonial rule in India. By equating political liberation with spiritual liberation, Gandhi connected social and cosmic law. And through the prism of love, he championed the idea of seeing self as other and finding God through righteous action. In doing so, he synthesized the Hindu notion of karma, or causality, the Jain philosophy of ahimsa, or nonviolence, the Muslim doctrine of zakat, or charitable giving, and the Christian ethic of the Beatitude. And for Gandhi, the Sermon on the Mount was one of the most important texts in his life, along with the Bhagavad Gita. So I will end this presentation with Gandhi's words, an eloquent reflection on the law of love and its practical manifestations in this world, both legally and, to use his term, scientifically. Quote, "Every problem would lend itself to a solution if we are determined to make the law of truth and nonviolence the law of life. Just as a scientist will work wonders out of various applications of the laws of nature, a man who applies the laws of love with scientific precision can work greater wonders. Nonviolence is infinitely more wonderful and subtle than forces of nature, like, for instance, electricity. The law of love is a far greater science than any modern science." Thank you.
Arun, thank you so much for your words today. Next up, we have Najiba Saeed Miller, who is an assistant professor of interreligious education at the Claremont School of Theology and director of the Center for Global Peace Building. Professor Saeed Miller is a conflict resolution practitioner, educator, and has published in the areas of interreligious conflict resolution, restorative justice in transnational cases of blasphemy, minority religious tradition in U.S. courts, and Muslim women's use of digital peace building. I've also had the great benefit of reading some of Professor Saeed Miller's works early on, which have very much influenced some of my own work, for which, again, I am grateful. And we're really glad to have her here to speak on law and love, humanizing legal systems, exploring the capacity for a humane approach to justice from the Muslim perspective. Could you give a warm welcome to Professor Saeed Miller?
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Pepperdine, over the years, has also been home to several of my engagements around conflict resolution in the region as well as transnationally, and a welcome place. So I thank you for this invitation, and thank you to the Glaser Center, with whom I've also had engagement, for organizing this event today. Let me start by acknowledging the historical importance of this conference and panel. Usually the lens employed when engaging religion and its forms in legal discourse is the problematic aspects of either the legal system or the religious emanation. This conference is important because it represents a third discursive space, one in which a generative, critical discussion on the role of religion, ethics, affect, and social condition can inform, transform, and form one another. Let me point out another aspect of this panel which I find profound, this particular panel. It is comparative in theological and legal inquiry that complexifies and problematizes the interaction between love and law. And it does it with epistemic commitments beyond the usual suspects of narrow definitions of religion, and more importantly, with an equal playing field for the communities of scholarship represented at the table. A multi-religious table that honors the rights of everyone to be present at the table. Now, this is different than an assumption of a normative belief in the validity of all approaches. One need not ask for an agreement in all of the approaches, but rather what we find is very few spaces in which we publicly perform internal exploration of religious traditions of the other who occupy a space with a critical eye. So we're doing internal critical inquiry into our own traditions, but also casting a glance at the experience of the other who occupies a space at the proverbial table and at the larger landscape of our society. We should not confuse multi-religious spaces for a watered-down, diluted scholarship. Here, our ethics of disagreement can elevate our discourse, sharpen our scholarly pen, and produce a result of interreligious education that is not only appreciative, but also intellectually rigorous in pointing out when religion has damaged humans and humans have damaged religion. I was asked to present a Muslim perspective on the configuration of love and law. Let me start with the answer of how multivocal the texts and scholarship of this tradition have been on this topic. and the fact that one Muslim perspective is nearly impossible to construct without horizontalizing an otherwise very pocked and pitted internal landscape. So what I will attempt to do today is to provide a few thoughts on how one might think through the textual resources and existing scholarship on Islam to produce the questions, again, the questions and foundation of a conversation on the tradition of Muslims linked to a perspective of love. I will parse out 3 points of entry into the hermeneutical and exegetical exercises that will need to be deepened in further convenings. First of all, the human body as the most excellent form of creation and the principle of no harm. The second, the performance of interpretation of law versus the higher functionality and the goals of said law. Last of all, the contested relation between mercy and love and justice, and the contested relationship, especially of the logic of the relationship between these three forces of interpretation and human existence. So let's start off with the substance of the human body. The primary and primal intervention of Eros into corrupted renditions of law, as we sometimes experience, is this: a reconfiguration of the dismembering of the body from the heart, the mind, and the soul. Dehumanizing and dislocation of dignity as performed publicly by legal systems must answer to the sacral elements of the ruh. The sacral elements of the ruh, the spirit that carries God, breathed into the body when we are encased in the literal and, as Ibn al-Arabi says, the transcendental womb. To marshal man-made structures in this fight against the body is a fundamental denial of God's existence if we use this reasoning. I am transfixed by the vast multitude of definitions of love in my own tradition. One might spend a lifetime unlocking each word to discern love and how it plays a profoundly centripetal force, magnetizing the being to her beginning. The Quran says the emanation of the human form is the gift from God, and creation of the human form is the most excellent of that emanation of God's existence. So one might imagine this: I am encased in the casing of love. The body is love itself. So this principle of no harm we can extrapolate if the human body is itself the casing of God's love. How do we look at the barbarism that emanates from legal systems and the attack on that very sacred, profound, and excellent, and in some ways holy space that is occupied by the human body? So if we look at William Chittick's work on Ibn al-Arabi, he says, Ibn al-Arabi begins his long chapter on love. Again, there are many, many words for love within the Muslim tradition. I cannot parse them out for you today, but particularly on love, mahabba, as he begins most of his book's 560 chapters by citing relevant Quranic verses and prophetic sayings. He points out first that love is a divine attribute, and he lists several of the Quranic verses in which God is the subject of the verb to love. 14 of these verses mention those whom God loves, and 23 mention those whom God does not love. In every case, the objects of God's love or lack of love are human beings. Indeed, the Quran associates love only with human beings among all creatures. Hence, love is a key term if we are to understand what differentiates human beings from other created things. Most other divine attributes, Chittick says, such as life, knowledge, desire, power, speech, generosity, justice, mercy, and wrath, have no connection with the human race. When Ibn al-Arabi turns to prophetic sayings concerning love, he cites first the famous hadith of the hidden treasure. I was a treasure that was not known, so I loved to be known. Hence I created the creatures, and I made myself known to them, and thus they came to know me. This is God speaking. Second, he cites a prophetic saying that he mentions innumerable times in his work. more often, I'm sure, than any other hadith, Chirik asserts. Again, it is a hadith Qudsi in which God is speaking, or to say God is speaking. Let me say this hadith for you. Those who seek nearness to me seek nearness through nothing I love more than the performance of what I have made incumbent upon them. My servant never ceases to seek nearness to me through supererogatory works until I love him. Then, when I love him, I am his hearing through which he hears, his sight through which he sees, his hand through which he grasps, and his foot through which he walks. So this notion of the human body, when it reaches a relationship of performing the acts of belief, become almost so connected to God. And we see this in Ibn Arabi's work and in this particular saying. So again, embodiment as a part of the hermeneutic tool of engaging love and its effect on humans. The second piece that I wanted to talk about was other scholars have engaged law with the critical eye towards deeper meaning, higher purposes, and articulating the maqasid, including Shatibi and others. They have added to the complex rubric of basic principles such as covering life, property, and other things to even include things such as compassion for animals. The reasoning tool, according to Kamali, is to recalibrate methodology and rulings with the eye to the purposes of the higher goals of law itself. Kamali says, for instance, the goal and the purpose that such promises pursue are often detectable in the context. The weight attached to such acts is often symbolic. It is not the acts in question that we should focus on necessarily. Rather, it should be the principles that they visualize, which may be mercy or compassion. And he returns again and again, Kamali, to one of the roles of law is mercy and compassion, or the merit attached to the remembrance of God. The expressions, which are in some cases figurative, are intended to make an impact or provide education and guidance. I will end between the relationship between justice and mercy. God describes God as the full manifestation among the 99 attributes that Muslims use to describe God. God describes God as the full manifestation of justice and beauty and of power. The push towards justice as the measure of a society and a human are often emphasized and really articulated as the key to a religious identity. One of the misguided nodes, in my opinion, is the presentation of the relationship between rahma and adl, justice and mercy, as a dialectical one, a competitive monocurrency that behooves one to exist only in the absence of another. Now, if the ultimate reality can reconcile both, there is a question of why human beings must insist that this illusion is impossible. Might not the divine intervention of God be one of expanding linear lenses beyond a simple structure of one or the other? Al-Ghazali says, mercy implies a pain-inducing empathy, which lays hold of the compassionate one. This moves a merciful person to satisfy the objects of mercy. So Al-Ghazali talks about this notion of mercy as one in which the human being experiences pain. It's almost a Levinasian ethic if we think of the face-to-face interaction. So if the divine has the capacity to have infinite mercy without experiencing pain, why might we not consider the role of God in engaging with law as expanding the human capacity for mercy? There is a prophetic tradition, a hadith that says God does not show mercy to those who do not show mercy to others. The vertical relationship with God and justice we receive from God is inextricably linked with the mercy we show fellow human beings. Divine interventions of love and mercy are the highest forms of love, a co-creation of beauty on earth between the horizontal showing of mercy between humans and the reliance on the divine light for expanding our hearts in that pursuit. The Quran says the goal and the mission of Prophet Muhammad was to be a mercy to all of mankind. The parsing out of a personalized justice, think of Bella's Sheilaism, when we become complainants of an unfulfilled justice without the corollary of what we are actively doing to engage in the exertion of mercy, is one that I wanted to pose as a question for all of us. So I want to end with this. If we love another human being, if we love another human more than we are seeking a retribution for their lack of justice for us, for the sake of love, not just between each other, but for the sake of God, we exercise mercy. Love upon love upon love. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now, as the final panelist for this morning's presentation, have Professor Chaim Saiman, Professor of Law at Villanova Law School. Professor Saiman is, as I said, a professor of law at the University of Villanova. He just concluded his term as the Grist Professor of Jewish Law at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, and he was recently the Simon Fellow in Religion and Public Life in the Madison program at Princeton University. His book titled Halacha, The Rabbinic Idea of Law, will soon be published by Princeton University Press. Prior to teaching at Villanova, Professor Saiman learned at Yeshivat Har Etzion and Yeshivat Kerem B'Yavin in Israel, shared that institution as a part of educational history, and he also clerked for Judge Michael McConnell of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, now of Stanford University Law School. He received his JD from Columbia Law School and held fellowships at both Harvard and NYU. His title today, Law as Love, the Mitzvah of Torah Study. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Saiman.
Thank you, Professor Helfand and Professor Cochran. The truth is, I want to now sit down and process the two fascinating presentations I heard, because there's a lot to think about there. But unfortunately, I have to babble on and talk to you. So I really wish I would have gone first, so then I could actually listen and process. Now, as Professor Cochran mentioned, the primary examples of love in the Torah are love of God and love of man. And since I suspected that much of our conversation would be driven here by the second half of that, by the love of man, I thought I would address, at least initially, the question of law and love in the context of the love of God. And then in the question and answer period, maybe we can extend it. So the verses I have, I'll read them in Hebrew because, if we're going to use translations, I don't know where to start. Ma ahavti toratecha kol hayom misichati, which translated in the King James, which I do not use at Villanova, but none of our hosts have shifted translations. Oh, how I love thy law, it is my meditation all day, says the psalmist in verse 97 of Psalm 119, which is by far the longest psalm in the Bible. Much of which is devoted to extolling the love and the virtues of Torah and its study. As a one-sentence motto for the Talmudic rabbis and their program, this isn't a bad summary. Because note that the verse extols not only someone who observes or expresses fealty to the law, but one who loves the law, and more particularly, one who loves to study it. The psalmist so loves law that he wants to do nothing else but meditate it all day. And some of you may know that this is a sort of chant that's sung in yeshivas, often sort of expressing the sentiment. But a few verses earlier, the psalmist expresses a possibly more radical sentiment that unless thy law had been my delight, I should have perished in my affliction. Life would be unbearable, says the psalm, save for the ability to delve into the intricacies of the law. Try that on your 1L students. So the psalmist writes that not only is law supposed to be loved and meditated upon, but must be a delight, a favorite pastime. What the National Football League is to our culture, the winding paths of Jewish law are to the rabbis. So in Talmudic thought, these ideas are crystallized into this idea called Talmud Torah, which literally means the study of Torah. As I'll use it here, it has kind of three basic tenets. First, there's a commandment or a mitzvah for everyone to be continuously engaged in the study of Torah. So, as I said in a different context, a normal society has about, 0.3% of its members as lawyers, and a much, much smaller fraction of even that small fraction as law professors. But Judaism is not a normal society because the rabbis understood that everybody should be some version of a law professor who enjoys and in their free time wants to engage in the details of the law. That's always more of an aspiration than reality, and maybe that's a good thing. The second one is that what's called Torah Lishma, or Torah is studied for its own sake. It's not only instrumentally to know what the rules are, though that's important, but because through the Torah study one confronts and encounters God himself, the rabbis understood, and therefore one studies Torah both for instrumental reasons to know the law, but also for other reasons. And third, that Torah study is on some accounts the most important commandment. It competes ideologically with prayer, with good works, so even with earning a living, and this is now causing lots of problems in Israel, but we can talk about that later. In other words, if one wants to do an act that brings them closer to God, in the rabbi's view of the world, one that opens a page of Talmud, the Bava Kama, to play off the Kama Sutra maybe, and studies what we would do in this building usually as tort law, but that is considered encountering God. So I would say while the Talmud and the rabbis are known for recording thousands of legal rules, I would argue that the most important contribution to the concept of law generally is that the study of law in itself is an expression of love. Now, why might this be so? And here I think we find one of the biggest differences between the rabbi's view of the world and the view of the world presented in the Gospels. Jesus and Paul often criticize the rabbis' forebears, the Pharisees, for focusing on the technical details of the law while ignoring its weightier matters. But for the rabbis, the law is the weightier matter. Because for the rabbis, the study of law is not only knowing what to do, knowing what the rules are, it's that the law itself contains instructions and metaphors for how we are to love, whether God or man. And by learning the law, we incorporate those lessons into our lives. Now, all this is pretty abstract, and the one thing the rabbis did not like much is abstraction. They believed in doing rather than talking about doing. So following their example, what I'd like to do for the rest of this talk is dive in and study a little bit of Torah and try to recreate this thing that we're going to talk about. Now, the very first set of laws discussed in the Talmud is, I think, not coincidentally, about the mitzvah, the commandment to love God, which of course derives from the rather famous verses in Deuteronomy, known as the Shema, right, which Jesus, of course, encapsulates two in his two most important commandments. And there it says in verse 5, you shall love, I can't read the King James, but you should love the Lord God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. And you're supposed to think about this and teach it to your children and engage in this when you're in your house and when you walk on the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. And you should bind them on your hand and the frontlets between the eyes. And I believe these are fairly well-known ideas. But for the rabbis, this rather abstract concept of loving God takes on a very concrete expression in the form of the mitzvah, or the obligation, to recite Shema, i.e. this passage and some others, twice a day, once in the morning, once at night. They're picking that up from the red, lie down and wake up and rise up verse. Now, in the context of this obligation, the Mishnah records a law and some debate about it between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, two of the famous first century rabbis. And they say as follows. So, the school of Shammai say in the evening everyone should lay down and recite Shema, while in the morning you should stand up and recite it, as the verse says, when you lie down and when you rise up. But the school of Hillel say no, each person recites as per his custom. In other words, as he wants, no specific gestures are required. And the Mishnah then continues to tell a story of Rabbi Tarfon, who was once traveling, which in those days was, of course, a very dangerous affair because you left civilization in the dark wilderness. And he lay down at night, nightfall came, and he lay down to recite the Shema as per the house of Shammai. And he endangered himself on account of the highway bandits who wanted to take advantage of him in this compromised position. And when he went back and reported this story to his colleagues, they said, you deserved it because you put yourself in danger for going against the words of the school of Hillel. Now, we have here a fairly common Mishnaic structure. There's in some sense a lot of agreement about the overall idea, right? Everyone understands you're supposed to recite the Shema, everyone understands it's supposed to be at night, and then there is a debate about one of the particular details, i.e. the gesture, the positioning one needs to be in. Now, for the rabbis, these sorts of things were often clues, right? Because the law is a multi-leveled sort of edifice. It's got the rule that you're supposed to do, but also supposed to tell you something about what the thing is you're doing. And if we look at this, we say, what's going on here? So a number of commentators explain that there's a fundamental debate here about how to recite Shema, in other words, how one loves God. Is that a thing that requires one to step out of their life right, and adopt a different position, a particular ritualistic position, because one encounters the holy by removing oneself from the ordinary and going to a different space. That's the view of Shammai, which is why you have to do that in particular gestures at each time. Whereas Hillel say, no, 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 it's exactly the opposite. The way one loves God and the way one brings that into their life is by doing the thing they normally do and incorporating that within that. And we see that the Mishnah favors the Hillel position because it criticizes Rabbi Tarfon for doing something that has no logic, i.e. you're traveling late at night and you get off your donkey and you lie down on the side of the road, other than the logic of ritual. And it says if that's the way you understand what's going on here, you've missed the point. Now, if all we wanted to know was the black letter rule, every school child knows that we follow the house of Hillel. That's sort of an overarching principle in Jewish law. But that's not enough. That would just tell us what to do. It's through the study of the text itself and understanding its positions and contrapositions, and we come to have a view of what the meaning of those very laws are. Now, not surprisingly, this theme shows up a bunch of times in the laws of Shema. And I want to take us now to the very opening words of the Mishnah that ask a pretty simple question to give a basically ununderstandable answer. The Mishnah opens with the question of from what time are you supposed to recite the Shema in the evening, i.e. when is night that the obligation and the requirement to say the nighttime Shema comes up. But rather than give a time that's useful like sundown or when it gets dark or when the stars come out, all words that the Mishnah knows how to use, it gives us basically what I call a hyperlink. It says from the time that the priests enter to eat their truma being food that the priests get to eat. Now, if this is a little puzzling to you, it was puzzling to many people. The Talmud asks, what kind of answer is that? Now, what's interesting is that in terms of Talmudic page, one finds that there's actually 8, including the Mishnah, opinions to this question. Now, even that is rare. It's usually 2 Jews, 3 opinions, not 8. So there's a whole bunch of them. And I want you to look very quickly at this list, and we'll see that a certain pattern emerges. All the times are framed in terms of when some group of people enter to do some activity. That activity often seems to involve eating, and that period seems to involve the transition from day to night, or from the public space of the day to the private space of the night. Now, if we divide this further, I think we can see that it kind of breaks down into 2 basic categories. One has to do with the priests and their ritual food. So this is one image of the world. Now you take a ritualized class of people, the priests, who are eating a ritualized food, this truma, and it has to be at a precise time, right, once the day is shifted, and we'll leave the details of why that is in that sense. But on the other side of the ledger, we have a different conception of time, a different way of organizing, right, what's going on here. We have everyday people doing everyday things, right? The poor person entering to eat his bread with salt, the regular people coming to eat a meal, and so on. So I would say that what's going on here is very similar to what we saw before. The Talmud notes that the possibility, the bandwidth with all these 8 opinions is about 40 minutes. Basically from the earliest time you could call it night, when the sun comes down, until it's really dark in the sky. And the Talmud says some of these overlap. So the debate here is not so much about how we measure time, but how we measure time. And what is the right metaphor through which to understand this practice? And here we see that the metaphors break into 2. Do we look at it as a highly ritualized, precise thing that's based on some ritual calculus of the priest? It's sort of, again, reflecting that view that one has to move outside of their ordinary experience? Or is it specifically within the ordinary daily experience that this happens? If I was to do it pictoriographically, I would say they're debating whether it looks like this or whether it looks like this. And this, of course, explains why it is that the Mishnah chooses to phrase the laws in this way, because, again, the black letter rule is clear. You do it once it becomes dark. But if you just said that, it wouldn't tell you anything about the meaning of what's going on, and that is why we study the Torah. So we could go on, because I basically just did the first 2 lines of a work, the Talmud, that extends over 25 volumes. But you get the idea. So in our mini-study, we get a glimpse as to why the law is so central to the rabbis. Because while they undoubtedly held that one must keep God's law, that the law is what one must do, it also comes to educate us about why we do it and what we're supposed to understand as we go about doing it. Hence, the love of God was not only observing the law, but studying it, which is how the rabbis developed the images and metaphor through which the mortal man comes to love and connect to the infinite God. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your words. We're going to open it up to questions now, and I guess I'm going to take a little moderator's prerogative if that doesn't bother anybody. I guess if it does, you're not going to tell me. Maybe, I don't think so. That wouldn't be very loving. And I'm going to ask the following question. I was wondering if each of our presenters could say a little bit, you described a little bit about the challenges of the relationship, the challenges and aspirations of the relationship between love and law in your own faith communities. Could you say a little bit of, in terms of education within your communities, lessons, ideas, something that we can all take with us, just thinking about how it is we can integrate these two concepts?
I would say from the Hindu tradition, the challenge is one of modernity, and I think specifically through the lens of caste. Law as dharma has mediated love as kama for thousands of years in terms of who can marry who and what occupation you can have in society. And that follows you around wherever you go. You know, my last name is Soni, so if you knew a little bit about caste, you would know Soni comes from Sona, which means gold. Therefore, I come from a caste of goldsmiths. Therefore, I'm the merchant caste, and Soni is affiliated with the Northwest, so I come from Punjab, and I'm Hindu. So just by my last name, you know occupation, you know religion, you know region, and it's hard for me to get out of that. That means I have to live in a certain way, worship in a certain way, and marry in a certain way. So I think as India has its encounter with urbanization and modernity, as it becomes a place where people live less in its villages and more in its cities, and as the Indian diaspora grows, it's the second largest diaspora in the world with almost 30 million people abroad. I think that these are the challenges we find with new generations who have different conceptions of how they should love, who they should love, and who in many ways reject the restrictions of caste. So I think as we think about love and law in the Hindu tradition, so much of it, as it manifests through the family unit, has been sort of articulated, mediated by caste and caste affiliation. That is, I think, the challenge. And so in terms of education, this is a new generation that thinks very differently about caste. India is the youngest country in the world. We have 500 million teenagers, 60% under the age of 30 of a country that has over 1.2 billion people. And for the most part, they reject, at least the urban Indian middle class rejects caste, and both in terms of social occupation, status, and love. And now the idea is that social mobility doesn't have to happen between lifetimes, which is the historical idea within caste, that if you do your caste dharma or duty in this life, then you'll move up in the next life. It can actually happen within your life. And also with love, with the advent of Bollywood films, which is a major thing. I mean, Bollywood is the film industry in the world. We think Hollywood is, but for most of the world, it's Bollywood. Africa, China, Latin America, India. So the Bollywood stars are the big Bollywood stars in the world. Well, the Bollywood movies are telling different kinds of stories that are really influenced by old school Hollywood musicals, where people choose their own lovers, their own spouses. They go against family, they go against caste, they go against tradition. So I think that popular culture has an incredible role to play in creating a new type of understanding which young people embrace when they think about love and law through the prism of their own experiences.
So I'm not exactly sure I understood the question, but
Pick what you thought it was and answer it. You can.
So I'm a lawyer that teaches at a school of theology. I'm used to making stuff up. So just kidding. Don't tell any of my colleagues that.
It's going up on the web.
Oh, great. Well, you don't know who I'm making up for what and whom. So I would say that one of the challenges we face is really a challenge of affect. And more we're beginning to look at the ethics that emanate from affect. And for instance, when one approaches a text, the affect that you bring as a scholar inevitably influences your interpretation. So if we're dealing within a particular perspective in which a community feels damaged, and then their approach to the text is to look for episodic mercy. And what I mean by that is, let me offer mercy when I feel that my history, sort of using as a valorizing tool. So I think that's a big issue. And some of the things that I have tried to do in my own education, because I think it's very important, the language that I use here and the work that I do around mercy and restorative justice is also one that I really engage in my own community, meaning at the very lay level. And one of the things that I think is helpful is to recalibrate hermeneutically the notion that love is a position of communal weakness, and moving it into the aspects of love being a position that counteracts what the Quran says again and again is arrogance. So arrogance, the state of the heart of arrogance, Quran gives, for instance, it says, if others incline to peace who are your opponents, you should move to peace. It is better to forgive than to use a retributive manner. And those are, I think, underutilized in modernity in interpretation, and seen often as just, well, that's a good idea. But how do we actually operationalize mercy and love as positions of scholarly strength in which to approach our texts? So there are those resources, but being able to actually perform that process is one that I think we share internally and also in the multi-religious conversation, one that we need to also address in our education. So one thing I'll just really briefly say is, in education of history of our traditions, in our own religious communities and in our pulpits, the way we teach even American history is punctuated by the wars, right? And one of the things that I think is very important for a Muslim space is where were the places in which peace was prevalent and love was operationalized, and what are the factors that led to that socially, hermeneutically, religiously, and being able to spend more time on that inquiry. I think that's another piece. The way we just teach history in general is to valorize a particular narrative, and so I would encourage us to consider that, because our own self-narratives are far more important often than how others view us. And if we internalize an interpretation that only allows for one range of possibilities because of the affect that we bring to the text, and that's highly problematic.
I would say it this way. One of the things, if I were to give this talk in a more conventional theological tone, I would have started by talking about immanence and transcendence and sort of developing those concepts, and then talking about how that might, are two ways to relate to God and what happens there. Now, part of my claim is that this is not a claim, this is just clear. The Talmud doesn't, the rabbis generally don't talk in those terms. My claim is that the legal rules often do the work of talking in those terms, but in a different way. So we could state that the premise is something like these grand ideas of, central to all human societies, whether religious or not, are encoded in these small particular legal details. But if that's true, or to the extent that's true, the converse is also true, and therefore a danger, that we can reduce great ideas and see nothing but simple rules. And this is a problem for Jewish law, and I think all legal systems have a formalizing, positivizing tendency. And here I think Professor White really shows the way of sort of how to try to avoid that issue in American law. But part of the reason this work is so necessary is precisely because, as we all know from our students and ourselves, right, there's something about law that's trying to kind of bring everything in and flatten it into some black letter legal rule. So the law is constantly bouncing between these two. I think it's a great tragedy, I would say one of the educational dangers, is to sort of always look for that and sort of ignore all the other things that are going on. Right? At the same time, right, if you just focus on these ideas, then there's no law left. So I think the challenge is, and I think this is true whether we think about Jewish law or whether we think about versions of American laws. On the one hand, law is sort of, a discourse of power, a thing that likes clear rules, right, precise categories and forces people into one or another and then does things based on that, right? That's the sort of law part of it. But there's also this other story, and holding those in balance is very hard. So I think one of the challenges of our own educational system, again, in either of these contexts, is to educate towards that balance, which I think is not reducible to a formula, but largely done by observing those who do it right, which is, I think, why the mentoring relationship, certainly in traditional Jewish education, is very important. And I would say it's not something that can be written down of how to do it. It's a balance that one feels by observing those that get it right.
Let me open it up to the floor for questions now. Yes, please.
So good morning. I'm very thankful for all the presentations, the three of you, and for both that, the three of them that came in the morning. I am an LLM student here taking the LLM in alternative dispute resolution, and I also take a master in spiritual sciences. And I think that's where my question is coming from, because one of the commonalities of everyday speech is associating love with our connection to the divine, with our connection to God, be it through the study of the law, be it through the Dharma, or whatever way. It was said here this morning that God, the monotheistic God, God is everything, and the idea of creation. And therefore, it seems to me that in order to connect law and love, we would have to somehow change our paradigms as to how we look at darkness, and our own darkness, as well as the darkness in society, and how we're going to relate to that. And traditionally, we have related to darkness in terms of, okay, let's put them in a prison, and when they're in the prison, let's treat them really badly so that they learn or they receive what they deserve. And I think that's very much a reflection of how we've been dealing with our own personal darknesses, which is let's just hide it in there, let's make it a secret, let's not talk about it, and therefore it perpetuates itself. So it seems to me that this discussion will have to open up in terms of individually, how we see our own darkness, how we relate to it, and how we resolve it, and then collectively how that is dealt in society. It's been said before, we do live in a world of mirrors, and therefore the structures that we choose to live by in society is somewhat a mirror of the structures we choose to live by personally and individually. So I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I want to respond. I guess darkness and evil collectively and individually.
And by no means our order is the level of which we feel our personal darkness at the moment. So I think one thing I just wanted to point out, I also, I've written a little bit about the engagement and interaction of this notion of ethics emanating not just from the exegetical engagement with text, but within the Muslim tradition, the epistemic commitment to the experience of the text and the experience of lived religion, if we use Catherine Albanese's terminology and others. So I would say as you're doing your work and your inquiry, being able to look at where law is publicly, privately, as well as textually interpreted and engaged. So for instance, one can imagine there have been many female leaders that might have had some engagement in law, but they're not found in the text. So what I mean by this is, for instance, Sayyid Hussein Nasr says that the mystical experience has an ethic in it. And in that ethic, it should inform and is actually historically been a counterbalance within the Muslim tradition to a highly legalistic, sort of parsing out the letter of the law without an engagement in the experience of the law and the effect that it has and the affect. So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's an interdisciplinary conversation, and with the advent of tools of psychology and others so developed that it should be a conversation that is not only theoretical, but also one that we can think about the phenomenology and the ontological implications.
Thank you for that. I think one of the things I'll say is that for the four Dharma traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, only two of them are really theistic, Hinduism and Sikhism. Both Buddhism and Jainism are non-theistic. I won't say atheistic, but non-theistic. That means that God doesn't really play a part in how the tradition is formulated and what its teleology is and how we engage with each other. Instead, it's predicated on a notion of compassion, of causality, that what you do to others, you're doing to yourself, and it takes sort of God out of the equation. So I think those traditions offer a unique perspective on love and law that isn't filtered through the lens of the divine. But in the Hindu tradition, so much of our understanding of the divinity is predicated on the internal, a reflective, contemplative approach to understanding God, that God resides within us. If you've ever been to a yoga class, you may say namaste. Namaste literally means the divinity within you acknowledges and salutes, or the divinity within me acknowledges and salutes the divinity within you. That's why you see God in India being depicted in many different forms, even animal forms. It's not that Hindus believe that the animals are God, though, like many people say. It's actually that the Hindus believe that God is in animals, God is in humans, there's multiple manifestations of God. So Gandhi talked about this a lot, that you see the world as you see yourself. So if you're looking inward for the divine and you're wrestling with your own darkness, then that shapes how you see and engage with the world as well. So for Gandhi, the real transformative work was the personal work that you do within yourself. If you want to change the world, he said, it's not about changing the world, it's about changing yourself. And if you transform yourself, and everyone transforms himself, then the world is transformed. So that spiritual discipline that he brings into Satyagraha is really an interiorization of the tradition that looks for an internal divine and understands that the way you wrestle with your own internal world, the way you engage with the God within, is also the way that you will engage with the external world.
Thank you for a rich presentation. I have a question for Professor Hussain. You outlined Judaism's approach to love and law as one which in part, I guess, includes a bifurcation between prayer and other aspects of Judaism, and then Torah study for the sake of Torah, like love as law. I recently went to a talk at JTS by Rabbi Shai Hel on his new book on Abraham Joshua Heschel. I read a little bit of the Baal Shem Tov, the writings on the Baal Shem Tov, and I wonder how you would sort of square the divide between Torah as Torah study for its own sake on the one hand, and then prayer as sort of competing with Torah study with the other approach, right, that people like the Baal Shem Tov or Abraham Joshua Heschel would take, which would sort of see Torah study as intimately connected to sort of the existential life of prayer. So I just wonder if you might talk about how love would fit in that framework as opposed to the one you outlined, or whether these are just competing traditions within Judaism itself.
Sure. Okay, I'll try to do so also without getting too into inside baseball, which is always a danger at these sorts of things. So I would say at one level, you're right that there are competing traditions if we're going to. So the original Protestants and the Jewish tradition are not what we think here of Protestants. They're called the Misnagdim, which literally means those who protest. And these were those who protested against the Baal Shem Tov and the Hasidic sort of, I would say, ecstatic spiritualization at the expense of a kind of more buttoned-down legalism. And that debate sort of goes back to the sort of beginning of the 18th century, as you pointed out. And you're right to detect a certain, I'll call it Protestant in quotes, and with the sort of centrism and sort of what I'm talking about within the role of Torah study. Now, of course, that debate goes back, like all good ones, to the Talmud itself and arguably to the Bible, in which what we see is a discussion of, right, should you spend all day in prayer or should you spend all day in Torah study? Meaning if today is the day I'm going to devote to God, right, what am I going to do? Now that's of course debated, and I think it does reflect two different things. I pick up on this in some part because I think this is the more unique one. In other words, I think many religious traditions would understand prayer, asceticism, fasting existentialism, mysticism of various sorts as a sort of divine connection, and those, of course, all exist to one degree or another in Judaism, of course, depending on where you're going to pinpoint within it. The point that I have not found elsewhere, it seems unique, certainly in its intensity, is this idea of law and the centrality of it. And what I was trying to offer, that itself engages in these other sorts of questions, but engages in it through the particularity of the legal discourse. In that sense, is very foreign, I think, to the Christian understanding, and even somewhat at odds with these, these schools of thought that you note within Judaism as well.
Please.
This is also for you, and I'm wondering if you could comment on what the relationship of law and love might mean in the context of the Noahide commands. And so, as I understand it, one of the 7 Noahide commands is the establishment of legal systems among Gentiles. And so, what would law and love? What would that look like? What would it mean? What kind of love might be involved there?
Sure. So I'm going to take this as sort of, like you said, and like I sort of promised in the introduction, I talked about love of God. What happens when we go to love of man? And I think here it has what to offer is that how do you get the law, if the way I understand sometimes what the rabbis are trying to do. Well, let me give you an example and the different ways or the different responses to the Good Samaritan issue. So as was noted this morning, when someone who I take to be a representative of the rabbinic sort of community or the proto-rabbinic community asks Jesus, right, who is my neighbor, right? So in other words, he's thinking of this like a lawyer. Jesus, you just set out a duty, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. So any good lawyer wants to know what are the properties, scope, right, and aim of this duty. And that's his question. Now what I find fascinating is that Jesus sort of rejects the premise of the question. He's like, no, if that's the question you're asking, you've missed it. And therefore he goes into this parable. And I'll let others who know more about this talk about what that means. Now what's interesting, if anyone who studied a page of Talmud said, of course you're going to ask, who is my brother? In other words, if you set out this duty and you want me to take it seriously, right, so then you've got to tell me what its scope is. And I often ask my students, I said, listen, if someone came to Jesus and says, look, I've got $10,000 in the bank. I was going to send my kid to college next year, but I've now spent, I now maybe have to spend it on putting up the guy in the hotel and paying his doctor bills and the whole thing. Would Jesus think that's a bad question? Now, I don't think so, right? At some point you have to ask that. I think one of the differences is where do you ask that question and when does it come up? And one of the things as I interpret the story in Luke is that if that's where you're starting, you're already going on to not what do I have to do, but when am I not obligated, right? And that's really what he's reacting to. The rabbis come at this differently. They say, no, you are obligated. And first we're going to kind of define that scope. But then very interestingly, in the Talmud, the discussion of basically the parallel case, it's not so much, they're about saving someone's property, not someone's life, which I think is important, but is the source for the idea. And they say, okay, but even though you don't have to do it as a matter of law, you should do it as what the Talmud calls to go within or really outside of the measure of the law. And that itself becomes a quasi-legal detail. So it comes to a not different place, but it does so under the architecture of the law. And I think that's why the study is important, because if you're just going to find the rules, you're going to look at it one way. If you go through and see where are the exclusions coming from, what's the rationale, what are the stories that they tell about the rabbis that sort of, in that case, all go beyond the law, right? You're going to get to this idea of how can we solve a regulatory question which has to have a floor, which everyone can do, but then set the goals aspirationally above that, where you could reach law, not by kind of bifurcating between either love or law, right, but by understanding that those two can come together. I think that's the way they approach it. I'll just add one second. There's a line of cases in American law in the 19th century that are picking up on this, where basically someone does, today we call it a restitution case, it's a quasi-contract case. Someone basically saves another guy's lumber, and he then says, it's Glenn versus Savage, and he then says, I want you to pay me for what today we call restitution. And the court says, no, you can't take an act of charity and now try to kind of bring in a sort of law into it. And I think that's like a very certain perspective. I think it's drawn from this Good Samaritan idea that like these are totally separate categories. That law is defined one way, and when we're in the zone of law, those rules apply, and then we're in the zone of love, or and the Talmud doesn't do it because it starts saying there's an obligation for someone to save, but of course there's also an obligation for the other guy to pay. That's the baseline, and then you go on top. Because I think these are just different ways of getting at that. But I see it as how you solve this regulatory problem of having a floor that everyone can live by, and then leaving aspirational room in there to grow.
Yes, please.
My question, I guess, is catalyzed by, I think, a reality that talking about integrating or having the law reflect love and talking about Christian love will spur people to think about the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and things like that. So I want to focus on the common bond between people of different faith traditions and see if I understand what I've heard. Because certainly in the Christian faith, there's a focus on unity, abide in me and I will abide in you. And God is love. God so loved the world. But I heard today a lot about unity, and I heard a lot about God is love. So I have read a little bit about how agape love is in fact embedded in major faith traditions, but I'd like to actually hear it from you to hear if that is true. Because if it is true, in a way I thought this conference was radical, refreshingly radical, making law reflect love. It will change the areas of law I work on so much, as I will talk about tomorrow. But if we have this common bond, it's really not radical. The question is, why have we waited so long? So we're really slowing the game. So that's really my question with the First Amendment hanging in the background.
No, you first. No, you first.
Thank you for that. It's tough for me to say anything that is authoritatively Hindu, because Hinduism is unique in that it is a decentralized tradition. There's no common god, pilgrimage point, scripture, language, ritual, origin story that is authoritative for all Hindus. In that way, it's a many paths, one truth kind of approach that is decentralized and regionally dependent, and also based on sort of caste affiliation, et cetera, et cetera. But from my own perspective as a Hindu, speaking from my perspective, I agree with you that at the root of Hinduism and other traditions that I've studied is this notion of seeing self as other, understanding that through the prism of God, and no matter how many different types of theological approaches I've studied or been exposed to, no matter how many years I've studied texts of different traditions, I do come back to the simple idea that God is love, and it does seem to me overdue for us to focus on that as a common thread that makes us essentially human, as opposed to continually focusing on the differences that I think divide us and have divided us over time. So from my own personal experience, I agree with you, but I think there are many authentic Hindu approaches to this idea. There are many authentic Hindu theological approaches to any idea. So as a scholar of Hinduism, it's tough for me to say this is the Hindu position on X, Y, or Z.
Oh, me, okay. This is, we have a joke I was born in Kashmir in Srinagar, and we have a joke about politeness where one person's waiting for a train. They say, no, you go, no, you go, no, you go, and then the train leaves. So I just wanted to briefly mention that I think that there are similarities, but I do think we also face a challenge of translation. So when we use the word love, when you use agape, I use the word muhabba, then I use the word ishq, which is the love that one develops in the spiritual transformation on a particular path. I do think the nuances are great. So we're essentially in an interlingual space. So as one of our speakers was speaking in Hebrew and talking about the challenges of translation, so I do think that there are differences that are often obscured when we have a lingua franca that is English in our particular context here. And what I think, what's unfortunate about that is it's not that it creates a hegemonic universal in all states, but it gives us a lack of access to what different traditions might bring to the table. So I mention that because, for instance, another word that I would introduce that I didn't have time to go into in my lecture was around I would say, a unique contribution of dignity. So there's a saying, this is very common actually to other traditions, the dignity of the son of Adam is in the human face. So when one is engaging in some form, the idea of not hurting the face is very important in the Muslim tradition because that's where the human dignity is formed from God. So I point out things like that. Dignity comes up again and again as connected to love and human dignity and human honor as part of the relationship between love between man and between humans. So I just wanted to point that out. There are nuances that are different. If I went into the particular currency of the word, ishq, muhabba, all the different forms of love, it would not always equalize the same experiences. Really briefly, I'm going to mention one other area that we have in Islamic law to draw on is urf, or culture, as a source of interpretation, but also as a source of often replication in our society. And I would point that I also think that religion never exists without culture. So one of the challenges we face is a transnational engagement with religion where culture may or may not be taken into account. So I was born into a South Asian emanation of Islam. Varun and I may actually share culturally certain factors of the performance of Islam and even the way we engage in our text that might be different than me and a Middle Eastern Muslim. I don't want us to forget. So I'm pointing out hermeneutically within Islam, urf or culture is very important. And I think that when we try to horizontalize, we sometimes lose how culture has played a role in forming that particular Islam or that particular Christianity. What if we're having a world Christianity conversation as well? So I just want to point out some of those dynamics. They have interpretive impact, and they also have potentially resources for further conversation.
I would subscribe to all of that. I would say as follows, add one thing. If we look in the Bible, right, there's many verses along the lines of "V'ahavta et hager," you should love the stranger, or do not oppress, for you were oppressed in Egypt, or do not this, right, that sort of line. But of course, right, there are other commandments, basically to liquidate the nations of Canaan to establish the Israelite kingdom. And I think, right, I think of these as sort of two paradigms. Like, what is the lesson you're going to take from Jewish history? There's we were oppressed, and therefore we should make sure no one else will be. Or we were oppressed, and now we need to make sure we will never be again. And I think it's not surprising that both of those can trace themselves to the Bible, because that's the real tension. And I forgot where the question was from. But so that's sort of, I see it as like in anything, you can go too far one way or another. There's obviously the question of Jewish survival, which is out there and I think real, and therefore necessitates a kind of a kind of more defensive stance. And then there's of course the opposite lesson, and the way I see it sort of playing out within Judaism is in trying to kind of get those two contradictory but important impulses right.
Well, we're a couple minutes over already, so I definitely would like to invite everybody now to join us for lunch. But one more time, if we could just give a round of applause for our wonderful panel today.